Way. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this webinar. My name is Jason Foster. I am the director of Parkland Institute, and it's my pleasure to be your host today. Although hopefully you don't have to, look at me too much because we do have two excellent speakers that you can listen to instead. Before we get underway, it's important that we acknowledge that where I am currently residing is located on Treaty 6 territory. It's the traditional home and gathering place for a diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Papas-Chase, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. And as we gather this afternoon to share wisdom and learn from one another and examine how to build equitable and resilient communities in the face of growing racism, hate, and violence, it is critical that we do so with an eye to the land and its people and in the spirit of reconciliation and decolonization. And I think in part to make sure that these land acknowledgements are more than just a simple gesture. I think it's important that we kind of connect it to the topic of the day. Well, we will, of course, be talking about workers and workers uniting in their workplace to improve their working conditions. And I think if we think about our Indigenous brothers and sisters and others, is they very much impart in us something we can learn from them, a sense of how we all have an obligation to one another, that all of us are a member of the community, and we all therefore share an obligation and a responsibility to every other member of our community for their well-being, their health, and their happiness. And so I think when we think about unions and we think about workers banding together to try and support one another, I think that is working in the spirit of that notion of us all having an obligation and a responsibility to one another. So hopefully we'll keep that in mind as we go through this hour. So the session will go for about an hour. We'll have about a half an hour of our report authors to give you a summary of their report, and then we'll open things up for question and answer. And so the way we're going to manage that is you'll see at the bottom of your screen there's a little box with a question mark. It says Q&A. So we won't be having people speak. We won't have don't put your questions in the chat because the other participants will not be able to see that. So I will be monitoring the Q&A section, so you can post your questions in the Q&A section. Feel free to do that even while the presentation is underway. It's not a bad way to get yourself to the front of the queue. And also then it also gives us some opportunity to kind of start to filter through and figure out kind of how we're going to manage that session. So feel free to do that as the presentation goes and as the question pops into your head. And so we'll manage that, and I'll remind you about that sort of at the end of the presentations. So now I have the great pleasure of being able to introduce our two study authors this afternoon. First, we have Dr. Andrew Stevens. He's an associate professor in the Faculty of Business Administration at the University of Regina, and he's also the Unifor Research Scholar in Labor Relations at the university. His most recent work with Dr. Sean Tucker and Emily Eaton, he co-edited Unjust Transition, The Future for Fossil Fuel Workers, which was published last year. Andrew's research focuses on the sociology of work, labor relations, and political economy. And our other presenter and co-author today is Angèle Poirier. She's a PhD student in the Johnston Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. She's studying food system governance and hopes that her work will help make the food systems in Saskatchewan and Canada more resilient. She has a bachelor's and master's in economics. She says that she loves economic analysis and data visualization. And she also grew up in a Francophone household and so therefore is fluent in both French and English. And she's passionate about knowledge mobilization in both of those languages. And so without further ado, let me hand things over to Andrew and Angèle to be able to walk you through the results of their study.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jason. It is a real pleasure to have an opportunity to present this report, this most recent report with the Parkland Institute with my co-author and collaborator, Angèle Poirier. I'm just going to set up the share function here. I also would like to acknowledge that this is project that has been guided along by the steady hand of the folks at the Parkland Institute. So Ricardo, Jason, and others who have done copy editing, helped with communication. A great deal of thanks for getting us this far, as well as some of the anonymous peer reviewers who actually improved the results of this study as a result. We were asked to do this following a similar project that we conducted in Saskatchewan specifically. And for this project, however, what you're going to see is we did some deeper dives into industry subclasses to get a better sense of how unions deliver material benefits, not just across a labor market, but in more granular sections of the economy and in industry. And we use those as examples and potentially inspiration for future studies if you really want to dig into the effects of unions, the material benefits they deliver at granular industry and sectoral levels. Sorry. So the title of the talk the report, Alberta's Union Advantage, Wages, Equity, and the Power of Collective Bargaining. What I thought I might do is actually just start with the conclusions, just so we can get a sense of how the analysis unfolded and how we want to frame the results of the study. First off, I think it goes without saying that unions in Alberta, like across Canada at the national level, North America, and globally, continue to deliver significant benefits, material benefits especially, despite the challenges. I'm certain that folks in Alberta are very well aware of what those challenges are. Most recently, the notwithstanding clause being deployed against Alberta teachers in an effort to circumvent whatever might have been gained through either a prolonged dispute or through arbitration. So that's a key takeaway. Despite all of those hurdles that have been put before Alberta's unions over the last 3 or 4 decades, there are still meaningful gains being presented and experienced by workers in that province. The second, in terms of the results, despite what we find to be aggregate material benefits by way of wage advantages and supplemental benefits for unionized workers, I think it's also important to recognize the mixed and often nuanced results at the industry and subclass level. So it's not an equal distribution of benefits or wage advantages across various subclasses. And what we find is most union wage advantage studies, stretching as far back as the 1970s, typically look at the broader aggregate figures at the national level. And we wanted to experiment a little bit and see what would look like at subclass levels as well. So beyond just the aggregate national advantage that unions offer. And finally, if there's a key takeaway, I think there's information in the findings that could be mobilized. And we would hope that the results that we are reporting on today can be used to inform a new generation of workers about the benefits of unionization and collective bargaining generally. And I think this is critical at a time when the cost of living is outstripping wage and salary increases, especially for some of the most vulnerable workers in the labor market. So consider this a call to use the information that we and other researchers are assembling in terms of the benefits of collective bargaining and unions specifically. And what do we find? If we're getting right to the point, we see the maintenance of a pretty steady wage advantage brought about through collective bargaining for Alberta workers. And despite all the challenges that we will identify, Alberta workers actually benefit the most by a measure of a percentage attributed to the wage advantage compared to national averages. And I think that's noteworthy considering that Alberta has one of the lowest union density rates, or the lowest union density rate in Canada. But we also know that unions do more than just deliver on wages, hourly wages and incomes. Unionized workers are more likely to possess supplementary benefits as well, which is of importance, especially for the lowest paid, most vulnerable workers and most precariously employed workers in lower skilled industries and sectors like food services. And that's noteworthy. I think generally speaking, what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades, some of the preliminary studies that we would see in the 1970s showed a pretty substantial wage advantage of 20 to 25%. Over the years, that percentage has declined. However, we're seeing kind of a leveling off and still the delivery of meaningful benefits for Alberta workers. Another conclusion here that's noteworthy is that the most precarious members of the labor force in Alberta benefit the most. And when I say that, I mean the percentage differential between a unionized and a non-unionized worker. And again, that's an important finding and something that needs to be mobilized in a particular way, because it's not just the white working class, middle class, income-wise male in stable industries that's the beneficiary. We're seeing those who are occupying lower skilled and more precariously employed positions that have pretty noteworthy benefits, especially when it comes to supplemental benefits. So what we can see here is just a snapshot from the report in terms of who benefits the most. Women, the numbers show, are the greatest benefactors. They have the strongest and the most consistent union wage advantage compared to men. We also know that, and what we find here is that unionization helps to reduce and actually narrow the wage gap between men and women in the labor market. So there's another ancillary benefit as a result. I'm going to pass it over to Angèle, who might have a few things to say about the influence of other factors. And the point here is that it's not just about unionization and collective bargaining, but there are other conditions and other variables that lend to the explanation of certain advantages or wage disadvantages. So Angèle, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Andrew. Um, so on screen, for example, the data that we see on screen is based on aggregate data. So the 19% in the top left, for example, we're looking at the aggregate wage of all unionized women and comparing it to the aggregate wage of all non-unionized women. But what if there were something particular about unionized women aside from unionization? Like, what if all unionized workers live in cities and the cost of living is actually what's pushing up that wage, not unionization? What about unionization concentration in particular industries? How do we untangle this stuff? Looking at wages in aggregate doesn't allow you to really sound the depths of the data. And so it leaves some of these questions unanswered. So us, as the studious, diligent scholars that we are, were not satisfied with that. So in our method of analysis, we went a step further. And so our method of analysis was to include some econometric regression. If you could skip ahead there, Andrew, please. So with econometrics, the results are predictions based on observed values from actual individuals, actual respondents, in this case to the labor force survey. So the econometric model considers all observations of the labor force survey respondents in a year and makes predictions based on these individual observations. Now, by predictions, I don't mean future, well, not necessarily future. By predictions, I mean if you had an individual that had these characteristics that match this data in this model, like unionization status, sex, age, education level, etc., what might we expect or predict that individual's wage to be based on all these covariates? One of the strengths of regression is that it isolates the effects of unionization. So this means that the model has the ability to zoom in on one variable at a time while controlling for others. It's sort of like plotting X and Y on the Cartesian plane and taking one covariate at a time and plugging it into that X and trying to see what the effect is going to be on Y, the wage, but you're taking into account all the other X's at the same time. So we're able to tell what is the wage boost provided by unionization apart from the effects on wages from, say, a demographic factor. Now, the disadvantage of regression is the same as that of any data analysis. It only tells us what is, not necessarily why it is that way. The analyst has to fill in those gaps based on expertise, research, consultation, And speaking of expertise, back over to Andrew for some more labor talk.
Okay, thank you. So when we use this method of analysis, what we find again is based on the 2023 figures, there's a 10% union advantage for workers in Alberta versus 9% across Canada. The narrowing of a gender wage gap. And I think if we go back to the precarious worker, what we find from this analysis is that part-time unionized workers would earn 29% more per hour than their non-unionized counterparts, which represents a pretty substantial gap. So that's kind of a symbol of where we got with this method of analysis. There's different ways of figuring out how do we get to that point. I think if you look at the context, it's noteworthy. As I mentioned earlier, Alberta has one of the lowest union density rates in Canada. I think that's symbolic of decades of antagonistic union legislations, examples of strike breaking, the introduction of double breasting as a way of fragmenting unionized shops in the construction industry dating back to the dating back to the 1980s. And more recently, when we saw the return of the United Conservative Party under Jason Kenney, followed by Daniel Smith, there was an unleashing of legislation that undid much of the progressive change that the NDP had introduced during its short tenure. And I think that's important. So the labor policy environment matters a great deal. I think what we might want to ask, and this is something that we don't land on a solid conclusion with, but density remains low in Alberta, yet it still delivers goods. And what we're seeing in some of the subsectors is that you might have a subsector or an industry where the union density is relatively low, yet the wage gains are higher than where union density is much stronger. So it signals some inconsistency with the effects of density. However, what we do find, and this will matter more later when we talk about inequities and social policy, is that much of the gains brought about through unionization don't automatically or naturally materialize. There's political advocacy, there's redistributive policies that are pushed ahead by different social forces and advocacy groups, labor being one of them. So much of what we're going to talk about, if there are gains or perhaps wage disadvantage is what we identify, is that there are other ways of accounting for them. And much of that remains a question mark, which is an invitation for further research. Another point to raise here about resilience is that we've seen, and the chart demonstrates this, an increase slightly in union density in Alberta. A lot of that brought about through growth of public sector employment, healthcare, for instance, where union density and membership is strong. But another way of showcasing, since the last Parkland report on the effects of unionization on benefits and wages, unions are gaining in percentage as a share of employment, as well as the actual real numbers within unions. What I've been troubled by in terms of finding a rationale for this, especially one, the only union that's seen a pretty significant drop has been the Christian Labour Association of Canada, which itself is quite contentious in the labor movement. But what we've seen is a pretty strong growth in numbers within Alberta unions, and that's noteworthy. This is also about what unions do in an economy. I think much of this is also about pressing an understanding of business unionism. So we know unions do a great deal more than just negotiate wages. There are health and workplace safety benefits. We see the decline over the years, but we're not trying to advocate for a return to a business union model, just looking at material interests, but rather exploring more broadly or an invitation to explore more broadly the benefits. But we're just going to focus on some of the material conditions here. And what we do find, again, is that if you're a member of a union and you're covered by a collective agreement, chances are you're going to have supplementary benefits. And the rate at which you'll have those benefits is far stronger in the lowest paid and ostensibly lowest skilled sectors. So while the wages might be at an advantage or a disadvantage in some scenarios, consistently what we see is that you're more likely to have benefits that makes a real material difference in those workers' lives. So this is one way of illustrating that point. Accommodation and food service workers, educational service workers, and others, retail, that's where the big wins are. So while we might see in some sectors a pretty banal demonstration of a wage advantage, benefits are the big wins for unionized workers in Alberta. Also, if we dig into this a little bit further, it's also about the hours worked and what it looks like in this respect. So it's not just a matter of how much you put into your pocket on an hourly basis, but also how much do you come home with at the end of the week. And again, we see pretty consistent benefits for unionized workers across the full-time and part-time spectrum, as well as for men and women. So it's a different axis of just looking at the aggregate level what those benefits might be. I might pass it over to Angèle to provide some context for this particular table and what it means to have both a negative as well as a positive when it comes to the union advantage.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. So what we see on screen is the industries in Alberta at the two-digit NAICS level. That two-digit, just put a pin in that for right now because that'll become more important later. But this is at the two-digit NAICS level. And these are results by looking at, again, aggregate wages. And so they're ranked in descending order by union wage advantage. And so it's just very simply looking at the aggregate wage for unionized workers in that two-digit industry, and then looking at the non-unionized wage and comparing the difference. How much more or less do unionized workers make? And so if it's a negative number, then those aggregate results are revealing that the unionized wage is lower than the non-unionized wage. And so as researchers, that made us scratch our heads a little bit. And so when we went and checked what the econometric model predicts, we actually discovered a couple of interesting things. One was that every single industry had a positive result. So once you start isolating, again, using the econometrics, isolating that union wage effect from the other noise, I'll call it, the other covariates that are putting upward or downward pressure on wages, everything was a union wage advantage, a positive number. However, what the model did agree with this table was the relative ranking. And so, for example, educational services is very close to the top, having the largest, one of the largest union wage advantages, and something like utilities and retail trade is closer to the bottom of the table. And so that result we still got that result with the econometric modeling. And so then the combination of those two results still makes us wonder what else could be going on to explain not just the union wage advantages and in aggregate the disadvantages, but also the relative ranking. Why do some industries benefit more from unionization than others? And so that led us on a pathway to speaking about a few different factors, which I think Andrew has some more comments about.
Yes, thank you. Maybe I'll start with a bit of a caveat on the other services. So for those of you unfamiliar with the North American classification system, other services is really a miscellaneous category. So it's tough to isolate that. We put it in there because it exists within the category system, but it's basically what is not easily fit into the other areas. So for instance, it could be those engaged in repairing or performing general or routine maintenance on motor vehicles, machinery, equipment, and other products, advocacy for social and political issues, And if we're going to explain what Angèle mentioned about kind of isolating the rationale, as one instance in retail and in utilities, perhaps that number might be explained by the high preponderance of part-time workers among the unionized workforce. In public administration, perhaps mostly clerical occupations and relatively lower paid administrators who are unionized. And that might put downward pressure on aggregate unionized wages as they're illustrated in this table. Similarly, in professional, scientific, and technical services, younger workers, those under the age of 30, might be overrepresented in the unionized population compared with the ranks of non-unionized workers, and that age variable might have an effect on outcomes and put downward pressure on aggregates. So that's an example of how disadvantages might appear in this particular table. Now, Angèle is going to talk a little bit more about how those differences work and what this means in terms of explaining the findings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrew. So what we see on screen is some of the factors that explain some of these differences. So education, job tenure, age, gender, occupation, outsourcing, and subcontracting. Now, in terms of education, we did find sort of what you would expect, which is the more educated that you are, the higher that your wage is. However, what was interesting is not only is your wage higher, but the union wage advantage also increases with education, with age, and with job tenure. And so those went hand in hand. Gender, this we looked at in two different ways, and we spoke a little bit about this at the beginning. Not only do women experience a greater union wage advantage than men, but then unionization also helps to shrink that gender wage gap. And so that's attacking the same set of data, but from two different directions. The first way, looking at union wage advantage, you're just taking the unionized women and comparing that to non-unionized women and seeing, okay, what's that union wage advantage for women? And then repeat that for men and see how the two numbers compare. And we found the union wage advantage is higher for women. The gender wage gap, however, is attacking it from the opposite direction, where we say, okay, let's just take all unionized workers and see what the wage gap is between men and women, and then repeat that again for non-unionized workers. And we found not only does unionization help to shrink that wage gap, sometimes it's even reversed. And actually, we don't have it on screen, but we found the same thing for immigration. Immigrants, whether they're landed in the last 10 years or more than 10 years, because that is a distinction in the data, tend to earn less than Canadians. But in some industries, unionization actually reverses that, shrinks and sometimes reverses, depending on the industry, that immigration wage gap. Occupation and outsourcing and subcontracting. This one became a little bit more muddy because I won't call it a problem, but just an artifact of the data is that the labor force survey, only goes down to the two-digit NAICS level, so that North American Industry Classification System. But we also had a special requested data set from Stats Canada, and that drilled down to the four-digit level. However, you're still looking at aggregate wages. And so unfortunately, we aren't able to perform the econometric regression on anything deeper than the two-digit NAICS level. Because we don't have the micro data at the individual respondent level. And so some of these nuances play out depending on various subsectors, and then you get into some, then you just need a really good working knowledge of the different industries. We also, it's not on screen, but we compared the public sector and the private sector, and had some interesting results there as well, which are explained in detail in the report.
Thanks, Angèle. Um, so what we did, partially as an experiment, but really to draw out what the findings are from this method of analysis on some key sectors in Alberta. And that landed on oil and gas, construction, and health. What would this analysis yield, and what would it look like if we're getting into various subclasses? One of the conclusions here is that the findings are nuanced and there are a great deal of uncertainties that are built into this method of analysis. As Angèle mentioned in the beginning, there's only so much that we can claim and so many conclusions we can draw from an econometric analysis in terms of what generates the quantitative findings. So there are some unknowns that are worthy of further investigation, but here are some findings. We know, like most industries, that there is a pretty substantial wage advantage for unionized workers, certainly in healthcare and social assistance, which is a broad spectrum of different occupations and industry classification systems. Construction has a very stable and consistently strong union wage advantage. But interestingly, in oil and gas, and I'll get to the nuances here in a second, it's almost at parity. While there's a slight advantage in some subclasses we identified, there's a -1 wage advantage versus a +1, so almost parity. So if we're looking at it by measure of the various subclasses, this is what we come to in construction. My dad was a construction worker in the 1980s and 90s here in Saskatchewan. So I have to say the story about construction workers and construction building trades unionism is a tragic tale. And a lot of that began in Alberta. It's an important industry because it employs in Alberta over 190,000 workers. It's skilled work for the most part, and it is relatively well compensated compared to other sectors of the economy. But in the 1980s, it was the site of very dramatic union busting efforts advanced by changes in labor relations legislation, as well as anti-union tactics and strike breaking by certain industry leaders. Think of the Gainers meatpacking strike in Alberta in the 1980s and the union busting that was launched against the building trades workers in that province and then subsequently in Saskatchewan at that time. And double breasting was one of those methods. In other words, you allowed companies to create non-unionized spin-offs and you can distribute contracts to the non-unionized employees or those who put away their union cards and decided that they were willing to work for a non-unionized firm rather than starve. And the effect here was a collapse of union density from about 70% to 10 in just a matter of 2 years, and wage decreases of 30 to 40%. So the fact that we still see a substantial and healthy wage advantage for unionized building trades workers in Alberta now, I think is a testament to that resilience despite the challenges. It still has a lower than average union density rate in the province. But about 17% of workers are members of a union of some kind, whether it's craft or wall to wall. When we dig deeper, we see some interesting findings. So, for instance, there's a union wage advantage in almost every subcategory except for highway, street, and bridge construction, where density is the strongest, I might add, along with heavy and civil engineering. Here, those workers are going to make about 14% less on average based on this econometric model. Ironically, residential construction workers enjoy 11% wage advantage despite having the lowest sectoral union density rate and being part of a very fragmented constellation of companies. So this is worth further exploration as to why they are able to maintain such a strong wage advantage despite having very low share of construction worker members. So this is an example of where there are nuances and uncertainties that emerge as we conducted this analysis. Healthcare is important. We probably think of healthcare as densely unionized, which it is. But if we drill into that, again, really interesting findings. The unionization rate is about 51% in healthcare and social assistance. At the same time, we're seeing the expansion, especially in Alberta, of private sector delivery options, which introduces non-unionized professionals into an otherwise densely unionized industry. The wage advantage here is strongest for social assistance workers with about 40% advantage. In ambulatory healthcare services, by comparison, there appears to be no overall advantages or disadvantages. In ambulatory healthcare services, most are not unionized, nor are the workers you would find in a physician's office, whether it's a dentist office or a family doctor's office, very minimal union density in that area or that subclass. We find that the union advantage applies both to the public and private sectors as a whole, a very healthy benefit. There's a solid 14% wage advantage for unionized workers in healthcare and social services generally. Hospitals, another interesting subclass, which makes up about 42% of all healthcare workers in Alberta, with a unionization rate of about 83%. Outcomes here are surprising in that there's a significant union wage disadvantage despite the strong union presence in this subclass. And there's uncertainty here, but perhaps for further exploration, one account would be the accelerated use of non-unionized agency nurses in Alberta's healthcare system. Requires a bit of additional investigation, but is that having a dramatic effect on wages? So in other words, you would pay those workers more than a comparable practitioner who's in the public system, who's also unionized, and that would therefore elevate the non-unionized wages by comparison. And so the disadvantage here is a structural one, not necessarily the result of particular bargaining techniques or the strength of unions per se. However, for part-time employees, no statistically significant union wage advantage or disadvantage. In our final subclass case study here, this one's interesting. I don't think anyone in Alberta needs a reminder of how important the industry is, and certainly not how much political space it occupies in Alberta. But we wanted to look at specifically those involved with extraction and extraction support in this subclass. And why did we do that? Well, about 90% of the oil and gas industry is populated by what we might consider to be professional or white collar occupations related to finance, office administration, and so on. So we're looking for those directly employed, about 5% of those in the sector. And again, it kind of comes down to an example of parity. And these subsectors would include all activities up to the point of shipment from the producing property, while support activities would include servicing wells, building casings and foundations, erecting and dismantling rigs, and so on. Refining would not be in here because that would be classified as manufacturing and not in the oil and gas industry subclassification system. Here again, almost parity. A combination, we argue, of industry-specific conditions and the wage-setting pattern established by unions and union avoidance responses might shape the semblance of parity in the sector. Density overall is quite low at 10% and just 2% in support activities. Unionized and non-unionized workers alike earn approximately the same and have a similar suite of benefits that they would enjoy as unionized and non-unionized workers. So as an example of how these nuances manifest. And then finally, if we come down to the intersectionality question, specifically, I'm talking about how would unionization differentially affect women versus men, young workers versus more mature workers, and then the migration and immigration question. So if we classify some segments of these demographics as vulnerable or marginalized workers, very clear, very consistent, and very strong benefits. And questions, why is it that the wage advantage for men comparatively has been sinking versus women? Part of it has to do with unionization, but also the occupations and the sectors in which they are employed. And here, I mean, one of the benefits is unionization also means stalling or reversing pay equity. And in healthcare specifically, the greatest gains for women in that the wage gap falls from 11% to only 3% when comparing unionized and non-unionized workers. Immigrants see, as Angèle mentioned, almost a reversal in some cases of the wage inequity that would exist in the labor market as a whole. So that wage gap would be about 16% it's virtually neutralized if we're just comparing unionized versus non-unionized immigrants. So there's a significant gain there. I think that's worthy of some promotion and mobilization. Young workers come out as the big winners. The youngest workers had the highest advantage of about 21% or $4 more per hour. However, the union wage advantage decreases as workers age very consistently over time. And that says a lot if we're thinking about how do unions engage with younger workers, how do they include them in what's being bargained, and how do you confront a political dispossession that might be felt with the Gen Z that has a higher appreciation if we're thinking about public opinion of unions, but very low union density by comparison. So an example that we highlight in the report is about who benefits based on different demographic conditions. And then our final point would deal with unions and inequality in Alberta. Alberta has the highest income inequality in Canada. It has accelerated fairly quickly with the return of the UCP. But the findings here, again, they're a bit more nuanced and mixed. So, for instance, again, Alberta has a great deal of inequality, but the lowest rates of poverty. Unions function politically as important levelers, but it's not something that we can conclude with certainty in Alberta on whether or not there's a direct correlation between unionization and density and the shifts in inequality. However, the weaker unions are by measure of density might represent a diminishing level of influence in policymaking and pro-redistributive policies. So perhaps it's the political influence that's being kneecapped that is the most significant if we're thinking about how unions might affect poverty. So for instance, it would be illustrated here, the Gini coefficient, level of inequality. There does seem to be appear to be a strong correlation most recently, but other factors exist. So I think our conclusion here is that while unions matter when it comes to redistribution of wealth, we can't determine with great confidence in Alberta on whether or not there's a direct correlation between density and collective bargaining access and inequality. And again, another vector that's of importance is there are provinces with much stronger union density rates. There are provinces like Saskatchewan with far less inequality, but far more poverty. So it's difficult to disentangle these different components and different variables. And Alberta has one of the lowest rates of poverty here. Finally, it's a matter of using this. So it's not enough to just say wages are necessarily increased. There's not a reductionism that we can abide by, but rather there are other variables that we have to look at. There are questions about what does it mean to see a diminished wage advantage for men versus women? What does it say about male-dominated industries? And are there political ramifications and implications that stem from that? And then finally, how do unions start mobilizing the precarious worker advantage and to demonstrate that they deliver goods for younger workers that are less likely to be covered by a collective agreement, less likely to be unionized, but typically have higher opinions and stronger, more positive opinions about collective bargaining, both in Canada and the United States. And hopefully some of the material benefits that we've outlined here can be used in strategic ways by labor organizations in the province. We'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Andrew and Angèle. We do have some time for some questions. We do have a few questions that have been popped up in the Q&A already, so I might as well just jump straight to them. As a reminder to the rest of you that haven't asked your questions yet, you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen there. It'll type in and then I'll read your question out loud. I may combine questions that are of similar theme or focus. I might as well just sort of jump right in. One of the participants is asking, can you speak to the reasons why we aren't seeing the same increase in union participation in the skilled trades and trades unions? I think maybe you've already partly addressed that, Andrew, but maybe you can expand upon that a little bit for them.
I would say from this analysis, we can't really comment on what's affecting union density. I say that's another question. I think it's a great one. But we can't, from this analysis or from this report, make any claims about why the union density rate is what it is in those particular subsectors. It would be a lovely conversation. And I could speculate, but the data and the report doesn't get into those nuances.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. This one might be for Angèle, I think. Do you take into consideration that some industries are highly unionized as you kind of parse through kind of the union advantage? For example, this person says, almost all post-secondary workers are unionized on some level, and so does the overall density industry to industry, did you factor that into your analysis?
Yeah, I will take that question. Thank you so much. And I saw it in advance. And so I did look up the numbers. In NAICS code 6112, community colleges and CEGEPs in Alberta in 2023. Yeah, looking at the right ones. It's actually only two-thirds unionized. And then in it's 50%, 50%. And then in universities, 6113, it's two-thirds unionized, just for the record. And so did we take it into consideration? I'll answer it in three ways. It's not, union density is not its own variable in the econometric regression, because industry is already a variable. And so we presume that an industry particularity is going to be picked up in the industry variable. Although, once again, at the econometric level, we can only go to the two-digit NAICS level. Um, and I guess I'll answer it in two ways. However, the report does definitely provide the statistics about union density, and then even in the deep dives, which we do have a section on education, one on construction, one on oil and gas. I do disclose the union density at these deeper levels, like I just did here in the webinar. But again, it's not a variable in the model, but it's weaved into the analysis as it's pertinent.
Great, thank you for that. And since you're talking, Angèle, I have quite a technical question here for you, I think. This person's sort of asking about why you relied upon NAICS, and they're wondering if some of the econometric analysis could be conducted using NOx, the National Occupation Classification. They're saying that particularly for healthcare public sector unions, it might be useful in terms of disentangling the data around healthcare occupation, do it by occupation as opposed to industry. Do you want to speak to that, Michelle?
Yeah, you bet. So once again, we had two major sources of data for the detailed analysis. One was a special request from Stats Canada, which comes in an IVT table format. And that's the one that goes at a deeper level than two-digit NAICS. So we can go to three and four-digit level. The limitations of that data set is, first of all, I couldn't get all the intersections that I wanted because the more variables that you include in your request, the more likely it is that there will just be suppressed data because you're slicing and dicing it too many different ways. And so the Stats Canada analyst actually puts a cap on the number of variables. So I had to give some up and I had to choose which ones I thought would be the best ones. And so knock is not a variable that I have in that data set. However, knock and NAICS are available in the microdata, so that's at the observation level, the weighted observations from the labor force survey. And so yes, knock is included in the econometric analyses. We did do analyses by occupation. I don't recall whether it made it into this final report. I don't think so, Andrew. Either because maybe the findings were not solving the mysteries. Anyway, so we did control for knock, but I do take the point that your suspicion about how knock could start to explain some of these findings. So thank you. And maybe I'll just end with anyone who's wanting to do future analysis on this, order special request data from Stats Canada and request the NAICS and the knock, because it's something we didn't do.
All right, there we go for future research. Maybe one for Andrew. Do you think high density in a sector raises wages for non-union workers in the same sector? Hence, high density shows less advantage, quote unquote, but everybody does better when unions are well represented in an industry.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say yes, that matters. We don't determine it with the analysis that we've conducted here. However, we do know that there is a wage and union effect in certain industries. And so unions with enough concentration in perhaps key sectors of the economy or subclasses can help create a pattern or sets of conditions that non-unionized firms would necessarily have to compete with. I'd say what would be interesting is if that applies to all sorts of different subclasses, but we know that to be the case. Um, I can speak anecdotally. There's a large potash company in Saskatchewan. They have both unionized and non-unionized mine sites. I spoke with the one of the directors of labor relations at the time, and it was known that they would pay their non-unionized staff more per hour. And their calculus was one, if we don't keep up with the unionized plant or the unionized mine, workers are just going to unionize anyway. And secondly, they considered it to be an advantage due to the savings that they didn't have to commit to the labor relations processes and regimen. So yes, unions certainly matter, and they can create floors or elevate the floors for non-unionized workers, and that's held true for decades. And I would speculate there are a lot of sectors here where that would also be the case.
Yeah, I think many of us in Alberta are quite familiar with Syncrude and Suncor in terms of a similar sort of a dynamic in terms of how the two kind of
Yeah.
manage each other, and one being union and one being non-union. Maybe another one for Andrew. Someone's asking kind of what the costs of a unionized workforce that employers bear. Again, I think you touched upon it in this last question, in your last answer. But why are employers intent on union busting or preventing unionization? And it's an interesting thought that they're thinking specifically about growing industries in Alberta, such as renewable energy, the solar and wind industries, which have extremely low unionization. Despite being high value industries. So I guess they're just sort of wanting to maybe sort of explore kind of that employer resistance and reluctance side of the equation.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, why does union busting take place? It could be for a number of reasons. If it's explicitly anti-unions, I mean, there would be some level of a calculation as to putting into place practices that would make it more difficult for workers to unionize or confront them in labor relations board disputes and so on. I'd say power is a big issue here. I'll think back to, again, it's anecdotally, but I think it structures the response. I had a student in one of my graduate labor relations courses who was, if you can believe it, he was a manager at an Amazon distribution center. And for him, it was very clear Amazon's practice as a matter of corporate policy was about power. And in some cases, their union avoidance was multifold. They would increase wages to be at maybe comparable to where the unions would be paying, or the unionized factories, or sort of the unionized distribution centers and other companies. And what they would do with all of their might is to create the conditions such that it was not advantageous to unionize. In other words, we'll create so much hassle that at the end of the day, you will gain very little out of this. And even if you make marginally more, it's going to be such a hassle for that union. And through collective bargaining, we might threaten in the labor relations board, we might threaten to leave a country and so on. That's a question of power because Amazon is known for making a great deal of profit and money. So it's not a financial hardship. I'd say in some cases, what we know is that larger firms are more likely to be unionized than smaller firms. And that might go back to the construction question. Um, Smaller firms, depending on the nature of their industry, might be less equipped to afford a labor relations person or staffing, et cetera, compared compared to a large multinational corporation in mining, for instance, that has the resources to commit to the actual labor relations function. So I think there's a whole host of reasons, but some of it's old-fashioned power and the resistance to subordinate any kind of decision making at the managerial level to the collective bargaining process, to unions or workers as a whole.
One final question, I think, for us today. This participant's would love to hear if the report has any recommendations around policy. And they also ask about data quality. I'm not quite sure what they're meaning about that, but you could sort of take that as you will. So maybe first Andrew and then maybe Angèle.
Sure.
Angèle seems to want, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. No, Angèle, deal with the data. That's a good one.
I have a lot to say. So I have recommendations for at least 4 different categories of people. For Stats Canada, I would like to see the labor force survey include the NAICS digits beyond the 2-digit level. I would also like to see the NOx beyond the 2-digit level. It's not very helpful for me to have a category that says like workers in natural resource extraction. Well, thanks a lot. That's a whole entire mining and oil and gas and quarrying category, you know? My recommendation for unions, Andrew, you might have more to say about this, is that they should think about their messaging toward precarious workers, given the excess benefits that we're seeing in these categories of precarious workers. Researchers, I already said it, but order Stats Canada data. It's only about $500 and do the NAICS by the NOx at those deeper levels. Dying to see that. For the public, visit Alberta Open Data because they do special requests from Stats Canada and then publish that data on their open data site. I know it's not available publicly. I know that they're getting that somehow. And actually something else that they also publish is every month they update the number of employees that are covered by collective bargaining agreements by industry and by the name of the agreement. And actually by the name of the employer, if memory does not fail. So, like, take advantage of Alberta Open Data because I have never seen anything like it. We do not have that in Saskatchewan. Wow, wow, wow. That's all I have to say.
Any last words, Andrew?
Yeah, so one of the reasons I undertook this study in Saskatchewan was there was a cannabis dispensary that was claiming that the union that was trying to organize its workers was committing an unfair labor practice by promising workers that in the retail that they would elevate wages and provide benefits. And they were claiming that that's not an objectively true statement. I think the recommendation would be to use the data to confront those claims and to show workers where you have weak levels of union density or where unionization isn't seen to have any affinity with that particular sector, that collective bargaining delivers the goods. We do talk a little bit about that in the end, but in terms of coherent recommendations is use this data, recognize how much it means for women, how much it reduces the gender pay gap, how much it reduces the immigrant versus non-immigrant pay gap, what it means to young workers to actually facilitate the growth of a whole new generation of union members who are disenfranchised and marginalized from the ranks of organized labor. So I think this is an invitation to use those numbers as a way of shaping organizing strategies, messaging, to mobilize, to talk about advocacy for these particular workers, that low density, high gain, as well as for part-time workers who are the strong benefactors of or beneficiaries of unionization. So it's in the report, but I think use the information strategically and move with it.
Great. I think that might be kind of the ideal closing point. It gives us all something that we can do going forward, something constructive to help workers in Alberta. So I think thank you for that, Andrew. And thank you to both Andrew and Angèle for both the report and this presentation this afternoon. It's excellent work that I know many of us will be able to take away in our work going forward. And then to the audience, once again, thank you so much for attending. If you like this work, if you like the work that Parkland does, you want to see us do more of this kind of work, a quick reminder that we get no money from the government. We get no money from corporations. We get no cash money from the University of Alberta. What we do comes out of money that we get from folks like you. average Albertans and organizations that care about these kinds of issues. We rely on you to be able to try and do our work. So please consider going to our website and donating. As a final word, the link to the report has been offered in the chat a couple of times, but you can also find that at the Parkland's website. And there will be a recording of this session that will be sent out to our supporters in the coming days once there's been, some little bit of editing and cleaning up and that kind of thing. So if you've missed part of it or you want to share this with others in your organization, that video will be available shortly. So that said, thank you again so much for spending your time with us during your lunch hour. And again, final thank you to Andrew and Angèle, and I wish you all a good day.